the thing I speak about most often is the hospitality of receiving. And here I actually have learned a great deal from Gandhi. I know who has a complicated and partly troubled legacy in Africa, but he quite often was asked to speak to Christian missionaries, and because missionaries found him fascinating, they could see his deep love for Jesus, but were puzzled by the fact that he never wanted to formally become a Christian.
Dynamic biblical discussions with special guests exploring tough biblical issues, academic scholarship, ethics, archaeology, textual criticism, Old Testament, New Testament, Bible interpretation, apocalyptic literature, Christian history, ancient Near East cultures. You're tuned in to Conversations with Pastor Cliff on Puluso Ministries.
Good day, everybody. Welcome back to another episode. Today we have a wonderful guest, and his name is Dr. Tatamanli, John, and he's a professor at Union Theological Seminary, and we typically call him Dr. T at Union Theological Seminary. Welcome, Dr. T, to Conversations with Pastor Cliff.
Delighted to be here and eager for the conversation.
Thank you. I know you and I have had extensive chats, whether in class or in person. And I know we're going to have an awesome conversation today on the nature of the articles that you have penned down, and just to piece them out and to have this conversation around them. Hopefully, it will help some of our audience that do follow us, and everybody else that's generally interested in religion and theological studies and how these things overlap. Perhaps before we dive into our conversation, Dr. T, many of our audience may not know who you are. Do you mind sharing a little bit of a background as to who you are and what has gotten you into the type of work that you are doing?
Sure. So I was born in the South Indian state of Kerala, and then migrated to the U.S. My parents had already settled here at around 8 years old. So 8.5, actually, almost 9. It's a very, very precarious moment in a child's life. I say to people that if I had come a little bit later, I would have known my mother tongue better, but I would only be able to speak with an Indian accent. So the coming at 9 is a very significant, I think, moment. When I got to the U.S. and grew up here, the question of what it meant to be Indian was of great interest to me. My being Indian Christian wasn't a big help because Christianity is the majority tradition in the U.S. So in trying to figure out what is it that's distinctive about being Indian, other than the fabulous food, I became interested in the study of Indian religious traditions, specifically Hinduism, and then also Buddhism. So I think that journey of migration is what brought me to the interests that I now have.
That sounds interesting, Dr. T. I know I've certainly grown from your work, and I've interacted a lot more with your work, and it has kind of helped me to navigate through some of the complexities that we'll probably talk about today. Perhaps as a start, you have an interesting take on the whole notion of religion. You say it's something that is more or less new in our vocabulary, something people in the ancient world would not have thought about religion the way we typically think about it. And how would you perhaps flesh out what religion is to someone who's probably not doesn't know how to actually piece that out and give them an understanding of what it means and define it for us, please?
Yeah, that's a complicated question. We may need to have several questions about that, but let me begin by saying that I do think it's a fairly new notion, the way we use it in modern and postmodern times, if we are indeed in postmodern times. And what I mean by saying that it's new is that for most of our traditions, the idea that there is a part of our lives, and only a part, that's the religious part of our lives, but there are other parts that are not religious, right? Or perhaps secular. That bifurcation between things in my life that are religious and things in my life that are not religious, I think that's the identifying marker of what we mean when we talk about religion. But that bifurcation would not have been understandable or comprehensible for most of the history of our traditions. So, in medieval Europe, it would be hard to conceive of the notion that some parts of my life are not religious, because the church and life with and under God is about all of one's life. There's no part of it that's said to be secular in our modern sense. So, for example, you may know that, in Roman Catholic traditions, there is this distinction between a religious priest and a secular priest. That
Mhm.
usage comes all the way from the distant past. The secular priest is the one who is a lay priest, in the sense that he's not part of any of the formal religious orders like the Franciscans or the Dominicans. Um, but clearly, if you can say secular priest, the word secular doesn't mean what we mean. And if you can say religious priest as opposed to secular priest, the word religious doesn't mean what we now mean, right? So just
Mhm.
this usage reminds us that people used to deploy these two words in very different ways. Now it is about cordoning our life off from certain aspects that are considered secular and no longer under religious or church jurisdiction. So the state is governed by secular authority, economics by the economists, and then we have this religious part of our life, and that's a defining marker of religion. Now, we can talk about what we now mean by religion, but my big point is that this bifurcation between the secular and the religious cannot be understood prior to modernity.
Uh-huh. It makes sense, Dr. T. Um, Tell me now, you mentioned in your article how not to be a religion, that there's this diversity that we find in all our religions, and that we need to recognize this religious diversity within our own religious traditions. And how does then an individual navigate through this complexity and still remain within their religious identity?
Yeah, so 2 points. I think one of the things that happens when our traditions become religions, I like to say that we've long had our traditions, but they've not long been religions, right? So I'm not saying that Christianity was a modern invention. I'm saying that the idea that Christianity is a religion is a modern invention.
Mhm.
So um, that's important to understand. And then when our traditions become religions, I do think that they become more homogenous,
Mhm.
more or imagined as more homogenous, whereas our traditions are actually immensely diverse. Um, I like to say that our religions are like our pantries or spice cabinets. Um, there's just so many ingredients in there. The ingredients that we use can be, might be a finite set, a pretty extensive finite set, but what we do with them is so diverse. Um, so it's important to understand that Christianity includes everything from, Coptic Christianity, Catholicism, the the Protestant churches, and within them the churches that are committed to radical nonviolence, the peace churches. to be a Christian is not therefore to be singular, but to be part of a community of conversation. I say that we recognize ourselves within any tradition less by what we affirm than the fact that we can recognize that we're part of a common argument or conversation. That's what makes us recognizable to each other. Is God one and three? Well, what that even means is something Christians argue about. Buddhists don't care. That's not their question.
Yeah.
So if you're part of our argument, you're part of our community.
Mhm.
And I think that's an important recognition that diminishes our love for singularity or a premature commitment to only one way of being anything. There's not a single way to be Buddhist. There's not a single way to be Christian.
Wow. Yeah. I like how you put it, Dr. T. And you mentioned something quite profound, that you say we have our traditions before we have our religions. And if we go back in time into the ancient world, we know they would not have had such a thing as religion as we understand it in modern day times. And also we understand that when we are maybe looking at the biblical text, for example, we are looking at various traditions that would have overlapped over time and formulated what many people would know as Christianity or Judaism today. And these are all different Christianities, to put it that way. And if someone then encounters that, how do they then make a shift in that understanding of their perspective in terms of their religious identity, knowing that they're dealing already within these texts with plurality and diversity, that it's so diverse, perhaps to their context, that they may actually be exposed to and know how to practice their tradition, as you put it, instead of being fixated on doctrine that they would have gotten from their religious tradition at a particular point.
Well, I mean, one of the things I say in that article is that even our focus on doctrine um, is, I think, pretty modern. That is to say, for most of the history of the Christian traditions in their diversity, I think in most places practices meant more than doctrines.
Mhm.
Of course, for theologians, doctrines always matter, but theologians are always a fragment of one's tradition, right?
Yeah.
So Christians were more identified by what they did than what they believed. The shift
Mhm.
from practice to belief is part of what it means. The part of how a tradition becomes a religion.
Mhm.
So the focus on creeds, the focus on doctrines, asking each other, "What do you believe?" rather than "What do you do?" That shift is also part of what I mean when I say traditions become religions. I wish we would return to a greater emphasis on practices, practices of spiritual formation in particular, because I think if we attended more to practice, Eucharistic practice, if you happen to be part of a Eucharistic church, or practices of service and compassion, um, you know, diaconia or service to neighbor and enemy alike, that used to be and arguably ought to remain at the heart of Christian traditions rather than this premature and almost obsessional focus on what we believe.
Mhm. Dr. T, I know one of the central arguments in your article is that we need to go back to this religious hospitality. It's quite central in your argument in this article. Could you perhaps provide some examples on how this religious hospitality could be practiced in our world today, which seems to be divided so much by religious differences anyway?
Yeah, I mean, the thing I speak about most often is the hospitality of receiving, and here I actually have learned a great deal from Gandhi. I know who has a complicated and partly troubled legacy in Africa, but he quite often was asked to speak to Christian missionaries, and because missionaries found him fascinating, they could see his deep love for Jesus, but were puzzled by the fact that he never wanted to formally become a Christian. That was a source of great puzzlement to them, so they often asked him to speak to them. And what Gandhi used to say to these folk were something like, I appreciate that you come to India with so much to give, and that you wish to serve Indians. But what I miss in you is an attitude of receiving, an attitude of receiving. Um, and then he tries to say to these missionaries, believe me, India has much to give you. It's astonishing to me that Gandhi has to make such a plaintive appeal to missionaries. And what he's fundamentally saying is, if you think that you only have things to give to the other, but you have nothing to receive from the other, that's actually an act of violence, right? To imagine that you have nothing to receive from another is to imagine yourself in an asymmetrical posture of superiority, giving from on high rather than receiving and giving in mutuality. So I think part of what Christianity has to do, or Christian communities have to do in our time, is to make this shift from thinking that our mission is only to give to the other, but not this profound act of saying, well, there are riches in your tradition that are not in mine, and I have much to learn from you. And I think that humility, which, by the way, many scholars have pointed out, Jesus constantly displays, we should display too. Remember, the Son of Man has no place to lay his head. If that's true, then the Son of Man has to be constantly in a posture of receiving. He has to
Mhm.
go into other people's homes. He has to be fed by other people. So that constant posture of receptivity was a part of Jesus' life, and I don't know why we don't attend to that. We only think of him as giving and healing, but the condition that made it possible for him to do anything at all for anyone else was that he was constantly receiving hospitality from others. So my argument is I think a profoundly Christian argument, that we ought to display the same attitude of receptivity that Jesus did. That's also essential to hospitality, not just the hospitality of giving, but the hospitality of receiving.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Um, I get that, Dr. T. And what is jumping right at me as I talk to you, I figure a lot of us would be placed in institutions of higher learning, or learning about, Christianity, or religion in a particular institution where we're getting educated about this. So what role do you see education playing in helping students embrace this religious diversity and this uh, uh, receiving, as you put it, this hospitality of receiving, as you put it? What role does education play in that?
Well, I think this is a complicated question. I'm not sure that we've all thought it through enough, but I think our institutions, our academic institutions, if they are to display this hospitality of receiving, must be places where a thoughtful person being trained in Christian ministry would also have the opportunity to learn about other traditions, not just for apologetic reasons, right?
Mhm.
So it has often been the case that our educational institutions might speak about other traditions, but really for the sake of contesting them in some apologetic way. Um, but I think we're entering a new moment in time where our challenge is to learn and work with people from a variety of traditions. for the sake of variety of purposes. Most centrally, of course, I think the healing of creation. So rather than thinking of ourselves as in competition with other traditions, we might need to think about ourselves as collaborators, contesting forces of violence, of nihilism, of ecological degradation, partners in the common work of healing the world. That way of thinking is impossible if our institutions don't actually make it possible for appreciative learning of other traditions and their wisdoms, rather than learning that's for the sake of contestation and apologetics.
Saying that, Dr. T, something may emanate from that. If one is learning about different religious traditions, or you would encounter something that kind of clashes, or there's some apparent contradiction in with what maybe someone may believe. And how do you, navigate through that while you are learning about what the others do in their religious practices to embrace that without completely losing who you are, your identity. How does one then hold that tension, and not lose themselves, but still embrace what other people are bringing onto the table?
Yeah, that's a fascinating question. First of all, I worry a lot about our love for identity. We seem to be in an age consumed by a fixation on identities, racial identities, ethnic identities, religious identities. Oh, the identities. I must cherish and guard my identities. How is that? How is that compatible with following the one who says, if anyone wishes to follow me, they must pick up the cross and follow me, right? There's something in the Christian project of following the Christ that's fundamentally about losing identity, losing your sense of what you think is so precious in the work of love, right? So I'm a little suspicious about our excessive love for identity in our time. This is not to diminish the force, I think, of your question, but just to caution that that there is potential hazards here that we need to be. There are potential hazards here that we need to be careful about. Um, Now, the differences don't just show up across the boundary line between one religion and the other. That's partly why I talk about internal Christian diversity, right? So part of why I emphasize internal diversity to any particular tradition is that it diminishes the idea that the real differences show up only when I'm talking to someone from another tradition. We have real differences between ourselves. When we appreciate that, perhaps we become less fixated on trying to get this all into some kind of common, unified, homogenous front. If Christianity is diverse, if African traditional religions are diverse, if Islam is diverse, then what is likely to emerge are patterns of recognition. Some Christians will say, "Oh, that feature of Islam is a lot like some elements of my tradition." So what you see is something like a cross-cutting pattern of overlapping similarities and differences. Um, so mystics across traditions will find, oh, we have profound recognition here. You're a lot like me, and that kind of recognition is what I'm trying to cultivate, right? But if Christianity is reduced to a single thing, Islam to a single thing, some core essence, then it's easy to generate conflict where there need be no conflict. I think diversities make possible wider recognitions.
Right. Dr. T, something is coming at me as I talk to you now. Um, you have extensively spoken about religious theologies of religious diversities extensively, and also comparative theologies. Perhaps maybe as a start, how would one then distinguish between the two? What is religious diversity, and what is comparative theology, as you have spoken about it in your article on embracing vision?
So, theologies of religious diversity is the work of clarifying what we say about others. That's theology of religious diversity. Comparative theology is our conversation with religious others. So, about and with. What I say about others, that requires attention. Theology of religious diversities asks core questions like, do I believe that religious diversity is the will of God? All right? That's a fundamental question. Christians can't avoid it. You do have to think about it. And so you have to say, well, no, religious diversity is just a mistake. Well, that's quite a claim, right? That God did not will religious diversity and wants us to work by way of evangelization to erase religious diversity. Well, that would be a hard exclusivist position, right?
Mhm.
Religious diversity is to be regretted. A more typical posture in many Christian churches is inclusivism. Other traditions may have a grain or more of truth, but we have in full what others have in part. So the word, the logos, to refer to how the Christ is named in the Gospel of John, the logos or the word is the light that illumines all persons, says John chapter 1, right? But that logos, which is the light that illumines all persons, has become flesh in Jesus. So we know the logos fully and others know in part. That's
Mhm.
a more typical way um, in the history of the Christian tradition than we might suspect.
Okay.
Contemporary Christian, particularly of a progressive sort, go even further and say, we all know in part. And because we all know in part, we have much to learn from each other.
Mhm.
Something like that is the posture that I would commend, that no tradition knows the divine wholly. What would that even mean to say? It's hubristic because our traditions emphasize that God is mystery. And so no one can claim to know the divine wholly, completely, exhaustively. So, given that our knowledge is partial, we need our neighbors to know the divine even more fully because their ways of practicing, their ways of praying will give them access to knowledge that I won't have because my practices and my traditions are different. So, we need each other for growing in knowledge of the divine life. That's theologies of religious diversity.
Yeah.
Uh, Comparative theology doesn't generalize. It's very specific encounters between figures, between traditions. Usually, comparative theologians don't talk about Hinduism and Christianity. They compare specific passages in texts and specific figures. Like I wrote a book comparing Paul Tillich, a 20th century Christian theologian, with Shankara, a 7th century Hindu theologian, 8th century rather. So uh, that kind of specificity is the mark of comparative theology because comparative theology is not talking about the other, but talking with the other. And when you talk with the other, it's always some particular other. You don't talk to every Hindu or every Buddhist. You're having a conversation. So
Yeah.
comparative theology has that particularity, whereas theology of religious diversity has a certain generality.
Now, as you expound on your answers, something that usually happens is that you'll find that a lot of people tend to think of view their religious traditions as offering them some, answers that, and knowledge that they ought to know, and they don't see a need to kind of embrace other people who may be of a different tradition. And what are some of the dangers with that, in being closed off, not to actually learn and have this interreligious dialogue among other religious tradition that may actually provide something that one may lack from their own religious tradition.
To ensure that we keep bringing you tough conversations like these, please support our ministry by donating as little as 50 Rand per month. You can find our banking details on our website, pulusoministries.co.za.
Yeah, I think in order to even ask that question, there have to be virtues that we cultivate in ourselves, which of course goes back to the question of practice over belief. What about the practice of intellectual humility? What about an attitude towards the divine that is marked by a kind of contemplative practice that says, well, surely I can't claim to know the divine, right? At the heart of the Christian tradition is the emphasis that God is infinite and we, by contrast, are finite. So, how can the finite claim to exhaustively know the infinite? It's literally impossible. So, on the grounds of core Christian commitments, I should be cultivating in myself a posture of intellectual humility, an openness to mystery, love of those who are not the same as me. If you love those who are your own, Jesus says, what is the good in that? Everyone does that.
Mhm.
So the love for the different, the other, this is the Christian invitation. So if the Christian invitation is about humility and love for the other in their very otherness, not an attempt to erase the other, but to know the other as the other, if these are core Christian practices and commitments, then I think we begin to move into ways of imagining my relationship with the other that is marked by what I talked about earlier as receptivity.
Mhm.
So I think apart from practices that cultivate humility, reverence towards mystery, we're not in a good position to really open up to the other. Uh, and therefore, my uh, almost obsessive focus on practice as an important step for modern, Christianity in this time, in modern times.
Mhm. And Dr. T, tell me, you bring this whole notion of practice to the forefront, which is great. Uh, but now, and you also point out that what you are proposing, or what you argue for, tends to help people not to slipping into fundamentalism or even exclusivism. But in your opinion, what do you think are the potential benefits for integrating comparative theology in education, in education programs, and modules in seminars to help students and religious trainers to cultivate this notion and the spirit of integratedness?
Your question is so deep and far-reaching. I have a sense that when we focus on belief to the exclusion of practice, I'm a theologian. I love thinking about beliefs. Uh, then we have trouble. We become focused on ourselves rather than focused on the world. Um, in the mid to late 20th century, missiologists started speaking very thoughtfully and made a simple claim: the church exists for the world, not the world for the church. Now imagine if we said something like that, right? Christianity exists for the world, not the world for Christianity. It seems silly to have to say it,
Yeah.
but sadly, I think it needs to be said, right? Christianity
Yeah.
exists for the world, not the world for Christianity. Our goal is not to convert the whole world into us, but to serve the world. I mean, remember core metaphors that Jesus uses: salt, leaven. If if the whole thing is converted into salt, who wants to eat just salt? It's no good, right? So
Yeah.
the idea that Christianity is a salt, or a leaven that transforms the whole without making the whole into oneself. These are core Christian images. So, but how can you possibly be salt or leaven if you know nothing about the other traditions of the world? It's an
Mhm.
intellectually impossible task to serve the other without knowing the other, without appreciating the other. So, our educational institutions must be reframed, um, if we really mean that we are one community among other communities, rather than one community that seeks to swallow all others. So the educational program has to be much more focused on metaphors of service and collaboration rather than conversion. What that looks like will differ particular context to particular context. Right, in India, it would mean much more attention to Hindu traditions, um, which has been happening now for some time. Of course, in Africa, much more attention to African traditional religions and indigenous expressions, not just the so-called world religions, and an attention then to what are the common problems that persons from every tradition are having to struggle with in our time.
Mhm.
That's the dynamic question to be asked in any theological context. Who are we seeking to serve? What are the forces that are making human conviviality difficult, if not impossible? How is, for example, global capitalism a threat to planetary well being? What can we do to cultivate a real care and reverence for nature? You think that only Christians have thought about these questions? How silly,
Excellent.
right? There are so many people thinking creatively about these core questions. So it's not just how can I learn more about God from people who worship differently or hold to different traditions, but how can I learn more about the world we share by others who are also thinking uh, from within their own traditions? You know, what would it mean to speak with um, a Muslim liberation theologian like Farid Isaac
Mhm.
about the economic predicaments that we are facing? How do economics how are economics imagined differently from out of a Muslim frame, which is highly suspicious about the consolidation of capital and even the charging of interest? Surely they know something about how to think differently about money than Christians do. So these are the kinds of real educational challenges and questions that we have to bring to bear as we think through the grave challenges of our time.
Mhm. Dr. T, I find that what you are propagating, specifically towards comparative theology, is more uh, growing. It's more embracing of the community. It's more embracing also personal growth as well. But now, how do you then, break down this power struggle that we find that is embedded in institutions that tend to shy away from our responsibility as communal people who are actually sent out into the world to help other people and also integrate with other people in, working for the betterment of the people in this whole notion that you mentioned as religious diversities working towards a common goal.
It's the nitty gritties of your question. The details are daunting. Um, I'm a theologian. I think about these questions at a somewhat more abstract level, but I don't think that's a bad thing. That's just the way I have to contribute to these issues. Others will have more concrete answers, but I mean, I would, as a theologian, um, ask all of us to interrogate the our institutional arrangements by asking, do the current configuration of our institutions speak more about the love of power than the power of love?
Mm-hmm.
Right? That's it seems to me one of the core Christian questions. It's been for Christianity the question since Jesus stood before Pilate. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Pilate, he is the incarnation, if you will, of the love of power, of empire. And Jesus, of course, is the incarnation of the power of love. So when they stand before each other, and Pilate just can't understand him, it's because his love is given over to controlling power. And so he has no way of making sense of the person who stands before him. Speaking of the power of love. Uh, so my question would be, what does the institutional arrangement of our Christian institutions bespeak? Does my institution or my church or my college really testify to the love of power rather than the power of love? And if I ask that question honestly, I might find that the answer I have to give is troubling.
Mm-hmm.
And then we begin to imagine how we might restructure our institutions in more egalitarian and justice seeking ways.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if that might be too abstract an answer, but I'll plead guilty and say I'm not a practical theologian.
Yeah, an answer from a theologian would be obviously expected to be more um, nuanced. We are actually struggling and wrestling with these things as we try and make sense of them, right? And what I'm interested in knowing, Dr. T, because I know these questions require us to have more um, of an of discussions and obviously reaching out to our fellow um, believers from different traditions in terms of learning from them. But are there any ethical implications that one or pitfalls that one may want to consider when they venture into comparative theology, in your view?
Well, I think from some of the work we did together in class is that we face a really delicate ethical question about how we learn from others, particularly across differentials of power. When learning feels extractive, then we are in dire ethical danger. When it feels like we're taking from others rather than learning with them, we have some real issues. So, the way in which certain practices are commodified or marketed and the connection between those practices and traditions of origin are severed, then we have some real ethical quandaries that need to be considered and reconsidered. So the question really is fundamentally, I think, about mutuality. So the way this works in current academic conversations is that we're thinking a lot about the category of appropriation, um, appropriation as opposed to mutuality in learning. That I think is one of the key issues. Of the broader ethical frame, I think, to think about all of these larger questions is perhaps best articulated by Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. In 1965, he gave this brilliant and still milestone lecture at Union Theological Seminary, where he was serving as a visiting professor from across the street at
Yeah.
Jewish Theological Seminary. And that lecture was called No Religion is an Island.
Yeah.
No Religion is an Island. I think it is one of the most amazing offerings in the history of interfaith dialogue. Many copies of it are available online. I'm sure you can link to it for your listeners. And in that piece, he talks about interfaith versus internihilism.
Mm-hmm.
That's a powerful ethical frame, right? There are powerful collaborative relations between the destructive forces of the world. Nihilism is also, if you will, interfaith in a peculiarly distorted way, right? The demons know how to collaborate, perhaps. So, for example, the great irony in the world is that nationalist movements, ethno-nationalist movements, know how to collaborate better than sometimes people working on interfaith. So, if you're going to contest the forces of internihilism, you need the collaborative work of interfaith. I think that is the best way to set an ethical frame around the whole of this conversation. I don't think we can do better than Abraham Joshua Heschel.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, Heschel was a very instrumental scholar. I mean, yourself, you've done a lot of work as a theologian and also as a professor of religion, and you've kind of helped us as well to bridge this, to build these bridges, to foster this inter-religious dialogue that is more healthy, to promote um, communities that are more peaceful. Instead of us being condescending and viewing other religions as inferior compared to what most Christians would do out there, to view their other religions from a perspective of Christianity instead of just viewing those religions for what they are for themselves. So perhaps you can touch on that. What is the danger with that? When we look at other religions with the lens of our own particular religious tradition.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the things we have to remember is that we're always not, how do I put this? We're never actually dealing with other religions. We're always only dealing with other humans, right?
Yeah.
And communities, right? Religions are abstractions. Persons and communities are the real substance of our mutual encounter.
Mhm.
If we forget that, which I think we routinely do, we're running grave risks. So that's one point. The other is, I wonder if when we think of the church or communal bodies that we mean when we talk about religions, whether we ought to ask ourselves if we are not caught in some kind of market share mentality, like I have to claim more of the market than somebody else. Can you imagine Christ thinking this way? I just don't see it. I think part of what we need to remember is we're never dealing with anything other than other human beings. individually and collectively. And the only posture that we are commended to have as Christians is a posture of love towards those communities. Can we love our neighbors despite their convictions? Right? Oh, I know you cherish these ideas, but I love you despite the fact that you hold these powerful convictions. That's a curious and contradictory posture. Isn't the holiness and beauty of my neighbor precisely the result of the way that my neighbor practices and lives? If so, how can I cherish my neighbor without at least some measure of appreciation for what makes my neighbor live and
Mhm.
flourish? I'm not talking very abstract things. I think I'm talking about very concrete relational features of how we encounter each other. Yeah, we can think about the complicated academic categories, but underneath all those categories, there are very, very basic Christian principles that I think are important in how we engage each other across religious difference.
And Dr. T, tell me, do you see comparative theology playing a vital role in the future of the academy and the church going forward, and the benefits thereof? In your view, do you see it playing a significant role?
Yes, absolutely. Once I've um, done the work and I've come around to the conviction that God cares about my neighbor, and if God cares for my neighbor, God would not have left my neighbor without witness, to quote the passage from Hebrews. If I'm convinced that my neighbor is in real relationship with the divine, even if in completely different categories, once I've made that decision, then why wouldn't I want to know how God has been at work in the life of my neighbor? Now, of course, God here is the Christian way we would have of speaking about the other. The other may have other categories. And that too I recognize, but I'm a Christian, so at least initially I will use Christian categories, right? So it, I now think that in the in our time there is no movement towards God that can be separated from a movement toward my neighbor. The life of holiness requires the life of reverence and respect for the commitments and practices of others. If that's true, then clearly in the academy, we need practices of learning with and from other traditions, right? So, hence, comparative theology is something we do because we've come to this recognition that divinity or the holy, to use broader categories than God, is at work in the life of my neighbor. And hence, I better be learning. That is to say, my own desire for God drives me towards the neighbor.
Mhm.
And that's the ground for comparative theology, where we respectfully study the texts, the practices, the insights of other traditions. And by the way, it's worth noting that many of the pioneers of what would eventually become comparative theology were not narrow academics, but monastics. I'm thinking of people like Thomas Merton, right? Who
Mhm.
took a deep interest in other religious traditions. Intermonastic encounter between people like Merton and the Dalai Lama, or interreligious encounters between Thich Nhat Hanh and Martin Luther King Jr., or the generational encounter between what becomes the Black freedom movement in the US and its constant learning from Gandhi. Our cultures and civilizations have been transformed by interreligious encounter. We don't have to say, well, what will this look like? We already know what this might look like in the way in which nonviolence movements globally have been seeded by the work of meeting across religious traditions.
Mhm. And Dr. T, after you've just said that, there's something that is dawning up for me as we talk about it. I know we have had these discussions, more extensively in class during our discussions, and now tell me, what is then the connection between liberation theology and comparative theology, or do you view it as a framework that particularly complements the other, or how do you see it?
Oh, one of the first books in comparative liberation theology has already appeared, and it's by my former doctoral student, Joshua Samuel. I commend his remarkable book that engages the whole question of untouchability. Uh, the idea that comparative theology and liberation theology need to be opposed is utterly belied by Dr. Joshua Samuel's work. And I think his worry is that comparative theology has often been guilty of focusing only on texts. So, what about traditions that don't have texts? Or
Yeah.
what about the way in which the texts that we engage are often the texts of the elites in a particular society? What would comparative theology look like if it attended to the margins? That question is now very much in comparative theology. So I think comparative theology and liberation theology can be deeply enriched by mutual encounter. So, I mean, I think I was talking some years ago with Gustavo Gutierrez, the father of comparative liberation. I mean, the father of one of the fathers of liberation theology, and Gustavo and I were talking about um, the shift in theology, like
Mhm.
that the much 20th century theology was given over to the question, how can Christian theology be intelligible
Mhm.
to the critical secular inquirer, right?
Mhm.
So theology was in that mode seeking to talk to the unbelieving or critically questioning other. And so much of theology in the 20th century has taken that form. But Gustavo said, okay, that's an important question. But the liberation theology's core question is, how can we say God loves you to the poor? Wow,
Mhm.
right? That it's not the apologetic question of how can we say something intelligible to the existentialist, but how can you say God loves you to the poor? Profound.
Mhm.
Um, I said to Gustavo, but we also have to ask, uh, how can we speak of God's love in Christ to those from other traditions,
Yeah.
right? And does confessing God's love in Christ mean the exclusion and erasure of other traditions? So that
Mhm.
question has to be asked too. And I think what you're pointing to is that those two questions, how can we say God loves you to the poor? And how can we speak of Christ's love to people who encounter God's love in other ways? Those questions
Mhm.
ought not to be separated. They can be separated for the sake of academic convenience, but they can't really be separated. This was a point that's not new to me. Alyosius Pierres, profound thinker of Asian liberation theology and Buddhist Christian theology, Buddhist Christian encounter, Alyosius Pierres has long been said, well, the poor of Asia are persons from other traditions by and large. So you can't actually do anything like liberation theology in Asia without recognizing that that is intrinsically a matter of interreligious dialogue. So I think that those two questions can't be separated. And of course, I think I should say that, yeah, Gustavo Gutierrez was remarkably open to that statement by me, and I think that can also be found in some of his work as well.
Uh-huh. You mentioned, Dr. T, texts, because other religious traditions have texts. You look at Christianity, you look at Judaism, Islam. We even have some Hindu texts and some Buddhist texts. But now there seems to be some danger that is not so overtly stated when you look at those texts, because some texts have a much superior or supreme position that they hold. One thing that jumps at me right out would be the Christian text, because a lot of people don't tend to view the Christian text as perhaps, or Judaism for that matter, as a tradition that got codified later. And then you also touch on this in your work, that these texts need to actually we need to move away from religionization of these texts to move back to the beauty that we find in each of these traditions, without looking at these maybe static texts that are also complicated in their own nature. I don't know, could you perhaps flesh that out a little bit on how we may engage with people who don't necessarily have text on the same kind of level, without raising up on the pedestal to think we pretty much better than them because they don't have any other text, and to show that these texts that we have were actually traditions that basically got codified.
Yeah, so it's a deep and important question. Let me just quickly say what I mean. Even in traditions that are text focused, let us remember that for thousands of years, literacy levels meant that only a handful of cultural elites could read those texts.
Mm-hmm.
So even when text mattered, sometimes it was the physical body of the text, the actual book, that was reverenced, right, rather than read. So the practice of reverencing a text rather than reading a text might have been far more important than actually saying, well, what the text says. So it's not surprising that a kind of textual focus requires, among other things, the emergence of the printing press. And then in Christian traditions, the translation of the text into the vernacular. So the idea of a kind of wide accessibility of the text to ordinary Christians, you can see that that's a very gradual process that accelerates rapidly after the emergence of the printing press and after the translation of the Bible into the vernacular. So even for Christians, we couldn't even focus on the text until we had it in our hands in our own languages. So let's not think that Christianity has always been a religion of the text. It's not true for us. And of course, the vast majority of Hindus don't have access to their texts in Sanskrit. So the text as it's heard or chanted, the text as it's depicted in art form, in statuary, right? We encounter the text in multiple ways, but often in other media, less by way of encounter with the written word in our own mother tongues. That needs to be remembered. And if we forget that history, we will misread the centrality of the text in our own traditions. It's really only central in historical terms relatively late in the history of Christianity. So that's one, which is not to say I want to ignore text, not at all. I also want to be very careful about the way in which, once the text is in hand, we say that the meaning of the text is its so-called literal meaning. This is a very, very new development, and I don't even think we have time to get into all of that. So I mean that many of the ways that we think texts matter and how we encounter texts are very, very recent phenomena. And then when we meet traditions that are oral in nature, we're reluctant to grant them the status of being a world religion, because if you're going to be a proper world religion, you have to have a text. So
Yeah.
entire indigenous traditions, all of the African traditional religions are marginalized and ignored because of our focus on the text. But what about encountering each other through our narratives? I mean, this is how people actually meet. They meet each
Yeah.
other by the stories they tell each other.
Mhm.
And so I think we have to have, including in academic institutions, especially in Africa, um, a more ethnographic turn in theology, where we actually learn how to listen and be in the presence of and engage, perhaps even in the practices of the other, so we know what the other means. Um, and until we learn to cultivate a kind of oral, AURAL, oral, and oral literacy, we won't be able to encounter the great uh, African traditional religions in any real depth. So textual skills, very important in the academy, but oral skills are also very important.
And Dr. T, before we conclude, because our time is running out, could you perhaps provide some of the insights that have probably helped you to, navigate, within comparative theology, and also being able to understand how it has, built you up to where you are, and seeing the value that it actually provides for us to have this ethnographic view, towards the other, and building the other, and standing up for the other, and embracing the other. How has that kind of helped you in your journey?
Well, I think my primary learning from other traditions is something that I should have never forgotten. And that is that theology is not academic text production. It's not the business of writing books. So today, we actually believe that the theologian is the one who writes books. And that, if you don't write theology books, you're not a theologian. So I have had very theologically gifted priests tell me, "Oh, Dr. T, you're the theologian. I'm just a priest." I'm like, what is happening here? Uh, I remind uh, Christians that the earliest definition of theology I know comes from Evagrius in the 4th century, who says the theologian is the one who prays truly. The one who prays truly is the theologian.
Mhm.
Now, why did I need my encounter with other traditions to remind me of Evagrius? Well, because I was caught in this theology is text production model,
Mhm.
whereas in Hindu and Buddhist traditions, theology is the quest for wisdom.
Mhm.
And when you read Hindu theologians, that's obvious to them, right? That the goal of theological thinking in Hindu and Buddhist traditions is to become wise, not to write academic texts, right? So, doing comparative theology in conversations with Hindus and Buddhists has meant for me a rethinking of what theology is and what it once used to be
Mhm.
before it became identified with university text production.
Mhm.
So, this is just one example of how serious engagement with other traditions can radically transform you and transform the entire enterprise of theology. Uh, I, I think who you spend time talking to will shape what your learnings are. Right? My learnings come from being in conversations with Hindus and Buddhists. Someone who engages with African traditions will have other learnings that are particular to the kind of encounter that you are having. And I can't wait to see what these other learnings are when people engage a diversity of traditions.
It's so interesting that you bring that up. I mean, because we've had on the show a practitioner from a background of an African, traditional religion, and the stuff that the insights they bring out are kind of helpful and very gripping, in helping us understand where we are going as a people. Uh, as you rightly pointed out, we're not engaging with texts, although texts are important for our religious traditions, but we're engaging with people. So it's also good to learn what other people are doing out there, and how other people view life, and how people engage in this plethora of wisdom that is out there. And I think that's something that I've benefited from, particularly from that person in particular, and also from your engagement, our engagement at Union as well. So I've pretty much enjoyed that. Dr. T, I know we can talk for hours, you and I, but we only have limited time. Perhaps before I let you go, could you is there anything that you are working on currently that you would want our audience to know about, and how to go about finding that information? If you have an online presence, you can direct them to those platforms. Is there anything that you're working on in particular at the moment?
There's much that I'm working on, and um, there are conversations and interviews with me in various platforms that I can share with you that you might wish to post. But I'm currently working on questions of post-truth, and why we've fallen into that predicament. It might seem to some to be a 2016 issue, and maybe even an American issue, but we are living in an age where misinformation and disinformation is rampant, and people
Mhm,
seem to be eager to believe all manner of unbelievable things. And it's causing us culturally enormous harm.
mhm,
And at the heart of that, I think, is a question of desire. I'm working on how it is that if we do not desire to know the truth, we cannot possibly know it. That sounds very obvious to say, but we have been in a period of time, and I think this is also a feature of the modern, where knowing is a function of cognition, and feeling is somehow which, by the way, is associated with not just the brain, but with something disembodied called the mind or soul.
mhm,
And feeling or desire is identified with the body. And so we have gotten into this weird situation where we have come to believe that desiring and knowing are either irrelevant to each other or opposed to each other.
mhm,
But I think this is a grave mistake. If we don't desire to know the truth, we can't possibly know it. And besides, I don't think desire and knowledge are opposites. I think they're two sides of the same coin.
mhm,
Love and knowledge are intimately and inseparably related. And this is a wisdom I think that, again, other traditions have never forgotten. Maybe Christians have under the spell of the Enlightenment.
mhm,
So I'm trying to figure out how to repair the knowledge predicament by really coming to see the knowledge predicament as a desire predicament. The issue is not with our cognition, but with the hijacking of our desires. So, anyway, that's a complicated thing. We could talk about that some other time.
Yeah, I think that's very complicated, but I mean, we can talk about it at some point in the future, and simplify it for our audience to actually understand what you're trying to get at. But I kind of afford it because we've had these talks, on the side. But yeah, I really, really appreciate your work, and I certainly believe that our audience have enjoyed your insights and your sharing of your knowledge. But that is more practical as well, and it's something that people can take and implement, which is of great value, I believe. And Dr. T, it's always great chatting to you.
Oh,
Thank you.
likewise. I so enjoyed this.
Thank you so much, Dr. T. And audience at home, we certainly hope you've enjoyed this, and keep tuning in. Until next time, God bless.
Puluso Ministries is a non-profit educational enterprise founded in 2019. The ministry is informed by academic scholarship. At Puluso, we embrace multiple perspectives in our engagement with Scripture. We seek to provide non-Christians and Christians from all backgrounds and denominations with resources that provide an honest intellectual engagement with the Bible. We embrace multiple perspectives in fostering a more open, moderate society into the 21st century and beyond.